You're watching the JJ Podcast. Mia Schlicht is an environmental scientist and research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, specialising in climate policy, agricultural sustainability, and Australia's natural resources. With a background in atmospheric science, science communication, and regional land development, Mia focuses on evidence-based environmental policy that protects both the land and the livelihoods of those that depend on it. And this is why we chose to speak with her today about climate science, Australia's energy policies, their impact on agricultural land, and of course, the recent decision made by the Liberals to back out of the net zero emissions target by 2050.
Well, Mia Schlicht, Research Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us today from your studio at work. It's great to have your company.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm coming in from Melbourne, so it's great to be able to speak to you about this today.
Now, you're an environmental scientist and a research fellow. And as you know, it is definitely dominating the headlines at the moment, but all about net zero and climate. And I just thought, let's just dive straight into that. And I just wanted to get your biggest frustrations off the top as a scientist. What are some of the things that we see and read in politics or in the news that gets your frustrations the most?
Yeah, well, that's right. So I studied science at Monash University as part of a double degree, and I majored in environmental science. And I guess my biggest frustration on this topic is just the lack of debate on the topic. We haven't really had an opportunity here in Australia to have our say. I mean, we had the Liberal Party sign on to net zero. Since then, the policy has had bipartisan support at every single federal election since then. So there is this narrative going around that our commitment to net zero is unanimously agreed upon within the community, specifically within the science community. But when you actually break it down, that's just not true. Support for net zero is not there. But yet we have our inner city elites and our politicians who are peddling this policy forward, and they're not allowing us to actually break down the policies behind this, the overarching policy.
Before we move on, Mia, can you just explain to all of our listeners exactly what net zero is? What is this target that politicians are trying to get us to achieve?
So net zero was this policy that was kind of born out of the Paris Agreement that we signed onto under Scott Morrison. And basically what it is the target is net zero emissions by 2050. So there are various countries around the world who put their hand up and said, yeah, we will commit to lowering our carbon emissions to zero by 2050. But the funny thing is when you actually look at which countries have committed to that, basically no one is on track to meet those targets. So you've got countries like India and China who are signed on, who have no intention of ever meeting those targets. So it's kind of like this ideological policy that's floated around. And here in Australia, we seem to be one of the very few countries taking that seriously to our own detriment. It's hurting Australians here in the country. It's ruining our economy. It's impacting our national security system. It's having all these effects. And the end goal, I'm not quite sure what it is, considering no one else is taking this policy seriously. I mean, we've seen the US has withdrawn, and I think we'll see other countries withdraw their support as well, because they're all kind of realizing that this is just a futile goal.
You mentioned, obviously, it was a Liberal Party that signed on to this, and obviously Tony Abbott, the original Paris Agreement back in 2016. What do you think the Liberal Party need to do moving forward to kind of reverse the decision and now sell this into the next election? We agree, we support what they've done, dropping the net zero target. Of course, reduce emissions wherever you can. They're admitting they want to still try and do that. But how do you think they sell it?
Well, here, the Liberal Party, the great step that they've made here is that we'll finally have a contest on this issue. And that's the first step to winning an election, is you've actually got to present an alternative policy, because as I said before, because the policy's had bipartisan support, we've had no opportunity to have that contest. But however, in order to win the contest, you need clarity and you need conviction, and you need to persecute that argument very clearly to the very end. My worry with the Liberal Party at the moment is they're kind of half pregnant on this issue. They've got one foot in both camps. At one end of the scale, they're saying we don't support net zero, but then they're saying, but we do support Paris and we do support lowering emissions. I think that confuses voters. It's already dividing the party. And if you don't present a unified front, then it's very, very difficult to execute the argument. So just taking, for example, the Voice referendum we had there. At the start of the Voice campaign, polling showed that 70% of Australians were going to support the yes vote. It wasn't until we had a really clear argument, which was headlined by groups such as Advance, and they had fantastic spokespeople like Warren Mundine and Senator Jacinta Price, who had really clear arguments, and they presented that contest really clearly. Here with persecuting climate policy, there needs to be one line, and I think they should go down the cost argument here. But by kind of arguing both fronts of we're going to step back from net zero but still support lowering emissions, it's too confusing. And I also think they're losing their base of supporters every time they focus on emissions rather than focusing on the fact that net zero is destroying our economy and aspects of the country.
Talk to us about the difference between some of the different methods of green energy out there. And I'm referring back to, it's funny, Mia, before the federal election, I had never really looked into nuclear as not even just an option, but I had just never really researched nuclear. And I spent a significant amount of time just to ensure that I was always armed with any facts if any voter came up and asked me about nuclear. But how does it compare when you have to assess wind and solar on things like reliability, cost, and environmental footprint? How does nuclear compare to those two options as an alternate model for energy in Australia?
Well, at the end of the day, wind and solar just don't stack up. That's the simple fact. They never will stack up. And that's why we're seeing, so many companies at the moment walk away from various wind and solar agreements because they just realize that what was promised, it was all a big hoax. And once they're actually implementing these new developments that don't work, they don't actually support the energy grid. And that's what we're seeing the problem with offshore wind in particular. Whereas, in the UK, they spent all this money developing offshore wind. Now they're realizing that it doesn't supply the energy they need for that grid. And now in Australia, we have various developments walking away from their agreements to establish offshore wind. So wind and solar, dead man walking. It's never going to work. Nuclear, if you are focused on lowering emissions, it is the clear alternative. It's being used around the world. But in Australia, we've kind of fallen into this fear-mongering campaign that's gone on for such a long time now that we're actually really behind the eight ball on this one. All the other countries who are leading energy production are investing in nuclear, particularly China, Russia, France, the US. They're all investing in nuclear. So to me here, it is not clear why we still have the ban on nuclear. I'm not saying that governments need to underwrite nuclear projects, and I think that's where the Liberal Party fell down during the federal campaign because they got stuck on the details. They got stuck on committing we're going to set up 7 different reactors. They're going to be near these communities. They got bogged down. Labor presented a costing argument that they fell into arguing, the details on their terms. I don't think we need to get into that detail. I think we just need to lift the ban on nuclear here in Australia and let the market decide.
Absolutely. I think that was where the fall down was. The Liberal Party almost wanted to run before they could walk on this issue. And I'm completely in support of nuclear. But some of the frustrations for us watching the party and watching the campaigning was, the fact that he never stood at a nuclear site. I mean, that was such a downfall.
Well, stand up for Lucas Heights. You stand out there and say, we've had nuclear since the 50s. And I was waiting for a press conference or something to happen out the front just to remind people that we have had nuclear in this country safely.
We use nuclear medicines.
Yeah.
All these things, and it wasn't executed. It wasn't, fought for hard enough. And they also, when I say that they tried to run before they could walk, that the policy probably should have been, if we get into government, we will lift the moratorium. Like that needed to be the very first thing, and then let the market really decide and really execute that plan.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And Dan Tian's done a great job in his portfolio at the moment. He's been off in the US visiting different nuclear sites to see how that would work here in Australia. But I do agree. I think for so long, Australia has just been bought into this fear-mongering. I'm not quite sure what that is. It is so out of date. We know it works. It's working very well in countries all around the world. So here in Australia, if we don't start keeping up, we will fall behind.
One thing that I would always often say, and I read this, and you might actually better correct me, but I would say when people eat a banana, if you eat 3 bananas, it's the same radiation exposure as what you get when you're next to a nuclear power plant for a year. Or if you're having an X-ray and the exposure that you get to radiation with that, there's things with avocados. And I think if we can just sort of remind people that it's in a lot of things that we are consuming, it is safe to be around a nuclear plant. It's safe to live near one if it happens to be in your community. How would you sell it to voters and individuals about what we were just saying about the fear-mongering? I don't think The Simpsons did us any favors either, Mia. The amount of people that kept saying to me, the three-eyed fish. But how do we
It's so dumb, though.
sell this? Because I would try and find things like the banana or the X-ray and examples that people can really think about that is in everyday use. What do you say to anyone who is afraid of nuclear reactors and the misconceptions that are out there about it?
Well, yeah, I think it's all about normalizing the issue at the end of the day and going back to that point that so many countries around the world are safely using it, and they have used it for a very, very long time. But just on that example, for example, of the three-eyed fish, I think it was the day that Peter Dutton announced their nuclear policy. Labor came out with all these images of household pets with like different growth deformities all over them, saying this will be your household pet if you allow Peter Dutton to continue down with this policy. But once again, it was the right playing into a left's field. The left was setting the agenda, they were setting the tone. So in terms of speaking about a federal election campaign, I actually don't think it's the coalition's job to sell the public on nuclear. All they need to do is lift the ban, but it's time to start throwing stones at the renewable agenda. Because as much criticism as we've looked into the nuclear agenda, let's start looking into the renewable agenda, because if you start poking holes into that, the whole thing immediately just falls over. But as I said before, we've never had the opportunity to do that. So just on the costings example, so Labor came out with the numbers for nuclear and said it will cost this much, and Dutton's going to cut your healthcare subsidies in order to pay for that. And that's where a lot of the fear-mongering came from, was he cuts, you pay, that kind of thing. Here we haven't actually poked holes at, for example, Bowen's costings. Labor has never released how much the transitions to renewables will cost. And they know that the reason they won't release that is because it is far higher than I think the general public understands. And when the general public is told that they're the ones who have to pay for this transition, that's where support for net zero is lost. And we know this for a fact here at the IPA because we did polling on it. And 98% of respondents to our poll said that they would not spend more than $500 per year in order to meet net zero. I think half said they wouldn't pay a single cent. Well, the news flash is that it's definitely going to cost you more than a single cent if we transition to wind and solar. So in terms of an election campaign, it's time to start putting the heat on Labor to start answering these questions that they have never had to answer.
We see it every single day on our socials. As soon as we release a reel, and it could be to do with polling, it could be to do with net zero, it could be to do with renewables, you get people saying, but renewables are the cheapest form of energy. And it's just so frustrating that people have genuinely believed the lie that Chris Bowen has fed them, that the wind and the sun are free. And Jamie and I were talking about this before we met with you today, just saying that the argument or the narrative, I suppose, needs to change now, because the truth is, yes, creating energy with wind and sun is cheap, but then turning that into electricity for households and businesses is not. The transmission lines that are needed. I mean, Australia, we can't be compared with countries in Europe because of our sheer size. We already have the longest NEM in the world. So this is the argument that's going to have to come out now, these facts.
That's exactly right. And if you look at the various countries like Denmark in Europe who did invest a lot in their wind and solar, well, now they're in an absolute energy crisis. So let's look at those, and they're now turning back away. And I think Denmark's now purchasing their energy from Germany in order to keep their grid alive, because the whole thing will just go under if they switch completely to wind and solar. And the problem here in Australia is that, well, we're an island. So where are we going to purchase our energy from when we get ourselves in that situation? But this lie that renewables are the cheapest, it has been told over and over again, and the public now have just bought it. I mean, there's a reason that they didn't let Bowen speak during the entire federal election campaign, didn't hear from him. He was under witness protection, because the second he said anything, it was just statements that were just wildly untrue, and it just gave ammunition to the other side to start going, really? Seriously? You're going to believe this? And I think he's out there doing it again. He's walking around saying that he's going to allow 3 hours of, free solar power to homes and things like that, when all the costings are coming out. Even AGL Energy about a week ago, they came out and said that renewables are the most expensive form of energy. It is a well-accepted fact now. So now I think it's really time the coalition starts persecuting that argument, tell it over and over again, because unfortunately there are so many Australians who have just bought this lie for the longest period of time.
Now, as a research scientist, you'll be able to clear up and answer some of the other misconceptions around nuclear. I think the number one question that I always got during the campaign, and it seems to be something that is a really big concern for people, is about nuclear waste. And what happens with that? Where would it be stored? And how safe is it? What is your response to that when you get asked those sort of questions?
Well, I should clarify that when I studied, so I specified in atmospheric science, so I can't pretend to be an expert on nuclear. However, in this job, I do spend a lot of time researching it, but I'm sure there are far better experts out there who would be better spokespeople than me. But what I would say is, well, if there's no way of doing it, why are so many countries able to? It's as simple as that. It's not some new technology that we're going to try and test and see if we can make it work here. It is working already. So to me, it's just absolutely, it's sabotage. It is some kind of form of energy self-harm for us not to be pursuing these policies that would make the cost of living far cheaper for Australians. It would bolster our energy security. It would help our national defence, and it would, improve living standards. I don't know why we are not investing in this technology.
You mentioned that you specialised in atmospheric science. What do you then have to say for those that are going on and on about climate change being an existential threat to us now? I think I mentioned to you on the phone, my little boy, he's 8. We've just been watching a documentary recently on Netflix that Morgan Freeman narrates, and it's talking about how there's been 5 times during the Earth's history where there's been almost entire extinction. It mentions, from volcanoes to the ice age to the meteorite, is that the word?
Yeah.
And the ash and cloud dust that covered the Earth, that then the planet didn't get sun, and that's ultimately why everything died off, the dinosaurs, etc. So if you've studied atmospheric science, what do you say to those that think that human impact is changing the planet so dramatically?
Yeah, well, one thing I definitely make the point clear that the climate is a very difficult system to understand. And that's why scientists are still trying to wrap their head around it, because a lot of these previous events that have occurred during the Earth's history, we still don't have a proper understanding of. However, despite that, that's not the message that's being told to the general public. So you're right to mention some of these events that have happened in the past. For example, we've had periods of ice ages. We had the little medieval warming period that occurred during a certain period of time. And that was due to volcanic eruptions and things like that. So there's been plenty of natural forcings that have occurred that have caused disruptions to the climate here on the Earth. But unfortunately, for just one example, so here at the IPA, we have a program called our IPA Schools program, and we look at the curriculum that's being taught to students in school. And one of those is how much climate catastrophism kids are taught during school, where they're taught this message that sea levels are rising at an unprecedented level. If we don't do something about it, the Earth's going to burst into a ball of flames very soon, and the future generations aren't going to have a planet to live on. None of that is true. None of that has been proven. If you ask any scientists, they will immediately debunk that and say this kind of climate extremism has been amplified to a very unhelpful level. And it also doesn't help when you've got mainstream influencers. The one example I always refer to is influencers like Abby Chatfield, who has no scientific background, yet she continuously spurts on her platform to her, hundreds of thousands of followers, that she's actually made the decision to not have children because she doesn't think there will be an Earth for them to live on by the time they grow up. Now, that is catastrophism at its finest. This just isn't true. And even if you break down things like the Paris Agreement and net zero, that was never told to be true. So I think there's a really important lesson here that we have to stop the fear-mongering within society. And we actually have to get back to the basic facts. And if we are going to fear-monger, then I think it's important to start talking about the lived reality that will occur if we continue down this path of absolute energy self-sabotage. For example, the number of Australians who will struggle to pay their power bills, the number of Australians who have to choose between heating or eating. These are very real realities that will occur in the immediate future if we don't start taking our energy system seriously. So rather than Abby Chatford running around telling everyone they shouldn't have children, let's focus on mainstream Australians who actually will bear the consequences of these terrible policies.
But yeah, I'm going to be taking out your grab when it comes to the rising sea levels, because my children, I've got a 5 and 8-year-old, and I've spoken about this previously. They have got they're verging on having climate anxiety because of what they've been taught, and they refuse to eat fish because of that exact issue that apparently the sea is dying, the ocean's dying, and the only way to fix it, according to them, is to not have any seafood.
We spoke about it with psychologist Claire Rowe, and I mean, she reckons she's got 6, 7, and 8-year-old. I've got to remove the fact that I just said 6, 7 from the podcast. She's got 6, 7, and 8-year-olds that she says, in her office, and not just her, but colleagues of hers that are child and adolescent psychologists that are seeing an influx of children crying, thinking they won't make it to adulthood. I mean, it's what we're doing to this next generation is unforgivable, really.
Yeah, and these are all very, very complicated ideals. As I said before, we've had scientists who've been working on this for years now, and they still don't quite understand, the interplay from all the different forcings. And there's things like feedback loops that all play into these theories that have been put forward. A very popular one is the hothouse Earth theory. That's, feeds into this idea that we'll enter this phase of forcings that will tip us into a point of no return, into basically this Earth just turning into this hot ball. Now, that hasn't been decided. That was a theory that was proposed in an academic paper. There is no scientific consensus on this issue yet. The mainstream has been told through the media and through our curriculum that is the reality, but it's just not true. So I think we have a lot of work to do to take some of these things back. Things like we need to rewrite the national curriculum to get our kids back to maths and English and skills that will actually help them contribute to society. There's no point drilling all of this anxiety into our future generations, where a lot of the blame is placed on people who. So basically what's happening with these children is they'll place the blame on the adults around them, where they're running around saying, around me, adults are doing nothing, no one's dealing with this, it's all your fault. That's not helpful either. So let's get back to the basics where they can learn the skills. If they want to go on and study science like I did, if they want to study environmental science, I'd really encourage it. It was a great degree. I'm glad I did it. But that's the important facts that we need to get back to.
Mia, I'd love to go back to some of the research that the IPA has done around the nuclear discussion. And you spoke before about the percentage of what people would be willing to pay. What's the breakdown in terms of the younger demographic, around your age, for example, when you're speaking and looking at the data, how supportive are they of the transition to net zero, but also around things like that nuclear discussion? Are they open to it being part of the energy mix, or is this younger generation anti-nuclear?
Well, what's quite interesting is when you break down the polling, and we do it in various forms. So we haven't just looked at how much people are willing to pay for net zero, but we've also just looked at a baseline level of support. Now, as you would expect, it is younger people, such as that group of 18 to 24-year-olds who are very worried about the climate because of reasons that I just discussed about, what's being taught to them in schools. So they're the ones who are pushing forward, saying that net zero might need to be some kind of priority. However, it's not nearly as many as you would think. But the interesting thing is that when you actually ask them about nuclear, it's young people who are very, very supportive of nuclear. And I think that's because they understand that if we really want to push forward with some kind of zero emissions technology, we are silly for not looking at nuclear when the rest of the world is doing it. So they're not the group you have to persuade. It's that group around 30 to 35-year-olds. That's the group who is holding back the most on supporting nuclear technology. But again, I think that's because we haven't actually had a proper debate. There's been no leadership on the issue. How can you expect younger people to start leading the way in hosting these debates when they've got political leaders that they themselves elected who are refusing to touch some of these issues? So that's where it starts. It starts with our political class to start having these conversations, say, hey, the rest of the world is leading the way with nuclear and we will get left behind.
Do you think the Labor Party are going to tie themselves up in knots? I mean, whether it be them saying 3.5 years ago that we're going to reduce your energy bills by $275, and then obviously they haven't been able to do it. This morning, Anthony Albanese was quoted in the papers saying that the reason energy prices have increased is because the Liberal Party didn't maintain coal-fueled power stations. So he's just trying to throw the blame on someone else entirely. And do you think they're now tying themselves up in knots with the nuclear thing, where on one hand they support nuclear submarines and on the other hand they don't support nuclear in Australia, and they want to tell you it's dangerous, but they can't tell you it's dangerous because they're willing to put people in submarines. So there's a bit of they're kind of tripping themselves up, I think, now. It'll be an interesting one to watch over the coming years fighting against them.
Yeah, for sure. No, the Labor Party will definitely tie themselves in knots. If the coalition is able to prosecute this argument, then I think the Labor Party is in big trouble because they've been given free rein for the last number of years to basically say whatever they want. And they've got away with it because no one's applied the pressure on them. So Bowen just gets up there and promises free energy and he gets away with it. I mean, it is ludicrous. So I think if the coalition is able to present a united front on this and be clear in their convictions, I think this will be a huge contest because the public is already not behind net zero. That support has shifted. The base is questioning this. So I think if they are showing some leadership and they are showing that it's okay to start speaking out against net zero, then I think they will, because for so long we were given this line that if you don't support net zero, then you are some kind of climate denier and that makes you a bad person because only moral people support net zero. But when you break it down, when you see what the consequences of net zero is, you no longer can feel like this is the moral argument. You can no longer feel like this is the right thing to do. And at the end of the day, people vote on feelings, right? Not facts. Facts are important, but you've got to change the way people feel about certain things. And that's what I think is really important, to break down those various elements. So one of them's the costing, because that appeals to people's hip pocket nerds. And the second is the moral argument of, if you look at what the rollout of renewables is doing, particularly to our regional communities, at the IPA, we've been out with various farmers all around the country, talking to them about their lived experience under net zero. When you see the way it's dividing these communities, tearing them apart, destroying their livelihoods, you no longer can feel like you're a morals person for supporting net zero.
Mia, off the back of how passionately and well you speak about nuclear and the whole energy transition, I really want you to be with the Liberal Party whenever they're out there talking about the messaging, because I think that's what's so important right now. Is they've come out and they've said that they're going to abolish net zero, but I just think it's so important now to ensure that for even just the next month, they have to get the messaging right, because if further down the track, if we're still trying to explain it, I feel as though we're going to have lost the battle. So it is so important that no matter what any backlash is or any negative feedback, it's staying strong and on the message, but ensuring that it's correct. What would be one thing that would be your takeaway for anyone that's listening, or even to the Liberal Party? I know last night on Sky, I said that we're now going to try and reduce emissions, but just not at any cost.
Yeah, I loved when you said that. It was great.
So what would be something that you would say to anyone listening as a takeaway of everything that you've said today regarding the energy transition, or something about nuclear that's just something that you want people to have in their head for any of these water cooler conversations, or something as a key takeaway?
I guess my key takeaway would be it's time to start putting Australians first. I mean, when you're voting for a politician on voting day, that's what you're trusting them to do. You're trusting that they'll put your interests first. But for the past several election cycles, Australians have not been put first. We haven't had a choice of policies. We've been stuck in this net zero cycle. We've never been given a chance to actually have our say. And at the end of the day, net zero hurts Australians first. And I think there are many families right now who are doing it tough. They've been sold these lies time and time again that the Labor government's going to lower their power bills, and that hasn't happened. It's only gone up. And so I think they're pretty sick and tired of not being heard. They're pretty sick and tired of not being listened to. And they're sick and tired of being fed these lies and then being told that there won't be any consequences for that. Well, the consequence should be that any politician or political party that isn't representing the views of Australia, they shouldn't be in government. And at the end of the day, that's who net zero hurts. It's the mainstream Australians.
You mentioned the mainstream Australians, and last week we actually met with an MD at a polling company. So we were asking about what the polls were saying on this entire agenda, and he said that when they started polling it, 80% of Australians were in favour of maybe not understanding what net zero was, but in favour of reducing emissions definitely in climate change and wanting to play our part. And then that turned to 50-50. And he said now he reckons it's down to 30% because people have realised the hip pocket impact, right? So it's definitely, support is falling away. So I think Liberals have made the right decision here. Just before we look to wrap up, I do want to ask you, with your background in environmental science, can you just talk about the environmental footprint? So when we talk about renewables, we keep mentioning the cost. What about the environmental impact? I mean, we say you need a couple of Tasmanias or something worth of...
And replace them every 20 years.
Worth of wind farms and...
Yeah. Well, my main frustration is the fact that we even call them renewables in itself. That's a marketing technique. But when you break it down, these aren't renewable at all. Yes, the wind is free and the sun is free, but that's not what this technology is. At the end of the day, what we do is we dig up our coal here in Australia, we export it to China. They then use that coal to power their factories to build our wind turbines and our solar panels, which we then import and stick on prime agricultural land that we now can't farm. Nothing about this is renewable. The lifespan of these technologies is incredibly short. I mean, I was just in a farming community recently in Albury, and they were talking about a solar farm in the area. There were about 100 solar panels had been damaged by a hailstorm, and the runoff was contaminating their local waterways. Now, they had been calling up that company over and over again, asking them to fix the issue. No one could answer because, surprise, surprise, the company has changed hands several times. So now it's a new developer that no one had been aware they had changed hands. Had been on the phone to their local MP and no one was claiming responsibility for it. So once again, it's the local communities who never agreed to this stuff in the first place who are dealing with the consequences of that. Now, that's just one example. This is happening all around the country. IPA research found that if we want to move forward with wind and solar, it will require 1/3 of our agricultural land. There is nothing about this that is good for our environment. Now, that's just counting the wind turbines and the solar panels, not to mention things like the transmission lines. And that's been another really huge concern of farming communities. And so many people in the city who support net zero, this is what they don't understand. They think it's all about lowering emissions. But at the end of the day, they're not the ones who have to live with a suite of wind turbines being constructed in their backyard. And they're not the ones who have transmission lines built across their business. So it's all well and good for them to peddle these policies, but for them it's out of sight, out of mind, and it's our regional communities who we all rely upon for the food and the fibre of this nation who are carrying the burden. And that's why at the IPA we've built our renewables rejection database, which is a national record that allows communities to go on record and say that they have rejected a renewable energy project in their area, so that we can show this and say this policy does not have the support of the community. And if you're going to go ahead with it, you're going to have to barrel through all these communities who are banding together to say enough is enough, because you're completely right. It completely destroys our environment. And that's not even to mention the waste of the solar panels and the turbines that just lay there unused at the end of their lifespan.
Mia, there's so much discussion now. So the Liberals have pulled out of the net zero by 2050 target, but they are remaining in Paris. Can you just explain to our listeners exactly what that means and why, I guess, it's important in a way that Australia stays within Paris for an overall global goal?
So net zero emissions, that's the target. We're saying we're going to reduce our emissions to zero by 2050, whereas the Paris Agreement is looking about keeping global temperatures below 2 degrees. So the two things are related, but there's slightly different commitments there. What I would say is that even in the context of Paris, so we've got countries like China and India in there, when you look at what's altering, well, what is said to be altering global temperatures, there are certain countries who are playing far bigger on this scale than Australia. So Australia contributes to about 1% of global emissions, when the leaders in this field are China and India and the US. And the US has pulled out of Paris, so they won't be held accountable. And India and China, certainly they're not showing any real commitment to these targets or to this international treaty. So if you look at the numbers, what Australia emits in 1 year, China emits in just 12 days. So even if we were to continue this commitment, all our work is undone by China in just 2 weeks alone. So there is this question of, when the goal is reducing global emissions, why is Australia committing so much self-harm when it won't make any difference to the actual global change that contributes to global temperatures? And at the end of the day, that's India and China's building tens and tens of new coal-fired power stations every single year. They're showing no sign of slowing down. They completely dominate the market. So they never will, of course. So there is this point to be made that Australia is shooting itself in the foot for no global gain here.
And plus, we're also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we're double the speed compared to other OECD
28%
countries about how fast we've been transitioning to renewables. Like, we're way ahead of everyone
we're like
else.
16% and we're 28%.
Yeah, well, we're just powering ahead. We're way ahead of all these other countries. And as you said, we emit 1% of the global emissions. So our little 1%, and we're doing more than all these other countries.
Yeah, of course. And that's what they'll say. They'll say that we're transitioning towards renewables at rapid speeds. But when you look at the energy grid, so not just electricity. Electricity is what most people think of, when they're turning their lights on and off. But you also have to look at the energy system. Here in Australia, 90% of our energy system relies on fossil fuels. So whilst you can use wind and solar to change the electricity grid, if you really want to commit to zero emissions, everything will have to change from the terms of what kind of car you drive, the way you heat your home, what kind of food you're eating. Every single industry will be affected. So that's why net zero is so important that the Liberal Party has pulled out of net zero, because net zero is a fundamentally illiberal policy, because it's all about centralized control. It controls every single aspect of your life. And so that's why we need to pull out of it.
I'd like to know how the Teal Party can go out there campaigning on the fact that, if we go and get solar and wind and, net zero and reduce emissions, blah, 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 the fires will stop and the floods will stop and the cyclones will stop and we'll be able to reduce our insurance premiums. But then they also say that they're about ending misinformation and transparency and integrity.
Well, yeah, all you have to do is follow the money on that one. The answer is always follow the money. The Teals receive a substantial amount of funding from certain groups who have vested interests in this industry. And that's part of the problem why it's so hard to dismantle a lot of the climate propaganda that goes on, is because there is a lot of very vested businesses in ensuring that we stay committed to these outcomes, because they're set to lose a whole lot of government funding if we finally admit that a lot of this climate policy is all a big hoax. None of it actually serves to improve environmental outcomes, because if you actually cared about the environment, you wouldn't be happy with the hectares of prime agricultural land that's being destroyed in order to get there.
Well, Mia, you are such a wealth of information and an absolute superstar. Thank you so much for joining us today and answering a lot of questions that people have regarding this energy transition. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the JJ Podcast.